My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the Rank Prize Funds this evening for the 26th presentation of prizes. Lord Rank established the prize funds in 1972, shortly before he passed away, to support research into two areas of science, optoelectronics and nutrition, that he had built his businesses on. Whilst he was not a scientist, he recognised the importance of research and its application in everyday use, and wished to invest in what he referred to as the British Nobel Prizes. Sadly, he did not live to see the full benefit of his endowment and the success of the two subcommittees through their diligent and well-judged application of these funds, both in supporting research and recognising the impact and application of the research in these two hugely important scientific areas. The scope of these areas are vast, with nutrition ranging from crop development and husbandry to human and animal diet, and its impact on health and the food chain, and to optoelectronics on the spectrum of emerging and developing applications whose growth has been rapid and exponential, considering the first prize in 1974 was awarded to research into cadmium mercury telluride, CMT, thermal imaging, and for me, a vital enabler for my time in the military service, although now it seems just day-to-day use for so many people. Now, over the last year, we have held symposia ranging from learning to see from retinal to brain computations to solid-state nanophototronics for quantum science and technology. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to Donald Bradley and Peter Shrewy and their subcommittees for their ongoing commitment to the fund's work and their inspired selection for the 2018 prizes. I would also like to record our thanks to Peter Shrewy, himself a prize winner, as he stands down after 10 years of chairing the Nutrition Committee. It is also important to acknowledge that the prizes and symposia have helped build global, formal and informal networks that offer cross-pollination of ideas and encourage and support young scientists. A great example of this is a recent informal gathering in Florida of those who had attended the Seeing the World Symposia in 2016 to develop their concepts and ideas. Given the weather, I have to confess that Mrs. Cowan is now hoping for a similar follow-up to the Dharma Photonics and Sources and Sensors Symposia, which we're meeting at the Wordsworth Hotel in April to discuss. On a more serious note, I'm hugely pleased to welcome back 8 prize winners to the 2018 prize giving. It is a testament to the importance of our work and the network developed around it that we can persuade so many eminent scientists to join us on a truly cold and bitter February night. I also believe it is important that the prize funds can support research collaboration as we enter a period of uncertainty for the UK research, with Brexit looming very near on the horizon. None of the legacy of the Rank Prize Funds would have happened without the support and guidance of the trustees and the Prize Funds home team. So I'm very pleased and glad to welcome back the Earl of Selborne to present the 2018 prizes. John was a trustee of the prize funds from its formative stages and the chairman for over 25 years. His influence and support of British science has been vast, from his commitments to the House of Lords and its science and technology, communications and environment and agricultural committees, as president of the Royal Institute of Health and Hygiene, Chancellorship of Southampton University, where I know many are present from here today, and currently as chairman of the Foundation for Science and Technology. Also, his deep knowledge and support for UK food and agriculture has been immense through his chairmanships of the Agriculture and Food Research Council and the Royal Agricultural Society of England, patronage of the Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, and his passion, closer to home, supporting Britain's apple and pear production. Before handing over, I would just like to pay tribute to 2 other members of the Rank Prize Fund team. It is unusual to raise this when we are here to celebrate 5 scientists and their significant achievements. However, these are exceptional circumstances, and I would like to record our thanks to Judith Delaney and Susan Bristol, who will retire from the executive team in 2018. This is the last prize giving that they will organise, perfectly as always, after a combined 60 years of service to the prize funds. Judith having joined the prize funds in 1980 and Susan in 1996. They have provided wonderful and thorough support to all that the prize funds have achieved. This has always been delivered with care, charm and deep thoughtfulness, underpinned by a huge commitment and a great attention to detail, for which we are all hugely grateful. We wish them well in the future and hope they will join us in future prize givings. I would now like to hand over to Professor Simon Bright for the citation for the Nutrition Prize. Simon.
So the Rank Prize for Nutrition is awarded to Keith Edwards and Graham Moore for pioneering research which has enabled plant breeders to exploit cereal genomics to develop improved wheat cultivars. So Professor Moore from the John Innes Centre and Professor Edwards from the University of Bristol have carried out pioneering research which has enabled plant breeders to exploit the genomes of wheat and related species for cultivar improvement. Bread and pasta wheat are polyploids formed from closely related species, and their genomes are larger and more complex than other major crops. Professor Moore unified cereal genomics by showing that the genomes of all cereals are essentially similar in the numbers and orders of their genes, a concept known as genetic synteny. This has allowed information from species with simpler and better characterized genomes, notably rice, to be exploited to identify genes controlling key traits in wheat. In addition, he elucidated the mechanism of the pairing lockers, which stabilizes polyploid genomes by preventing mispairings of related sets of chromosomes. This understanding has facilitated the use of mutants to allow transfer of useful genes from related species into wheat for breeders. And finally, Professor Moore has led the development of a public sector wheat pre-breeding program which brings together the major wheat research groups, including that of Professor Edwards, to deliver improved lines and tools for breeders in the UK and internationally. Professor Edwards has throughout his career been at the forefront of the application of molecular and genomic tools to crop improvement, and has had immense practical impact on the global research community in both the private and public sectors. In particular, he has led the development of new DNA marker systems for wheat breeding with a pioneering commitment to establish these tools and resources in accessible public repositories. Consequently, his cereals database website is the most widely used global source of data on wheat genetic diversity. To achieve this, Professor Edwards developed innovative approaches to reduce the complexity of the wheat genome, focusing on the small part of the genome which comprises expressed genes, and has exploited this information to develop high-throughput methods to distinguish differences between and within the individual genomes of bread and pasta wheats at the level of single DNA-based changes. This now allows simultaneous determination of over 800,000 molecular markers in multiple wheat samples. He's also developed a simplified breeder's chip widely used in commercial plant breeding, which determines variation in 35,000 DNA markers. Together, the work of Professors Moore and Edwards has brought wheat into the forefront of crop genomic research with a significant practical impact on crop improvement and global food security.
To work in an area of food security has been a privilege. And I know Graham feels exactly the same as I do. It's been a wonderful experience over the last 30 years to work in this area. To be honoured in the way that we just have been honoured is humbling. And to see so many people from the community that we represent here today is fantastic. And I would like to thank everybody, and specifically those people from the wheat community for coming here today and sharing this pleasure, because it is very much a wheat community success, if you like. The problem that we have is the problem that we see on the board. Now, this might well be a little bit over the top. This is definitely headline news designed to grab attention. It may or may not be true. If you do the calculations, then it possibly is true that we have to generate more food over the next 50 years than we've generated during the entire history of the human race. That's quite frightening and phenomenal. But if you look at the number of people that are here today on this planet, and you look at the amount they consume, then the figures suggest this. Now, it's very easy to get despondent and depressed at these kind of figures. The one thing that you can say about the human race is that we are inventive. We tend to create problems, fair enough, but we also tend to solve them. And so far, we tend to solve them a little bit quicker than we create them. However, when you take it down to a little bit more of a basic level, then you see if we are to increase the food supply to the level that's required, then we have to increase it by so much per annum, and that so much per annum is about 1.6%. So each year the yield of wheat should go up by about 1.6%. And if we can do that, then we're meeting the demands. At the moment, though, and in recent past, that has not been the case. In recent past, we've been increasing by less than 1%, more like 0.7, 0.8%. So we're falling short, and when you start to fall short in increase, then with an increased demand because of increased population, then food prices go up. And when food prices go up, not necessarily in the UK, but in many parts of the world, then it starts to create social instability and problems, economic problems, other social problems. So it's a very big issue. Okay, so this was recognised over 15 years ago by the BBSRC and various other people in various reports that were generated about that time. What was the response? Well, the response from BBSRC was to say, okay, we need to start investing in wheat research, remembering that wheat is the most important crop in the UK by a considerable distance in terms of the acreage grown and in terms of the value of that crop. I think, though, although BBSRC decided that they needed to make this investment, their biggest success, and I hope that they knew this at the time, was that they asked Professor Graham Moore to head that initiative. They asked Graham, so we're talking about 2009, 2010, to bring together the wheat community in a coordinated manner. This is the academics, this is industry, to work to each other's strengths and to collaborate and cooperate in an open manner. So we have something that's quite unusual down here. There was an agreement from the beginning that everything would be public. Nothing would be kept aside for IP within the academic camps. Everything would be given to industry, for industry to develop and to take forward as breeding material, because industry in the UK is the best at doing that. So I think that the big success at that time was getting Graham to be in charge of that programme. So this is the Wheat Improvement Strategic Programme, WISP, as some of you may know of it. And many of the people in that programme are in the audience today. And Graham said many times during the initial stages of that he was to act as an honest broker. I think that was the word that he chose. And that's exactly what happened. Throughout the past, what we're talking about 8 years now, then there's been open cooperation, collaboration between those people, driven by, exclusively by Graham. And you'll see that we have all of the institutes here, various organisations, universities, and all of the plant breeders going forward. Okay. The whole purpose of that programme was to increase the diversity of wheat. You'll see my voice get a little bit higher now because this is the bit of the science that I get excited by. The whole purpose of that programme was to bring in diversity, because diversity is the stuff of breeding. You cannot breed, you cannot generate better varieties unless you have diversity within the populations that you're breeding from. Where do you get that diversity from? In the case of wheat, the actual crop itself has relatively limited diversity. But wheat is an incredible species. Begging the pardons of the distinguished people here, but it'll have sex with anything. It's very promiscuous. Thank you for that. It's very promiscuous. However, it's very promiscuous under certain circumstances, and it was Graham's pioneering work on the pH1 lockers that determined when it was promiscuous and when it didn't need to be. And by unlocking that mechanism, it meant that we could cross wheat with lots of different species and bring in the diversity of those species into the breeding material. And this is not GM, this is classic breeding, classical breeding, just using material which is a little bit more diverse than you would normally use. And the secret was this pH1 lockers. And the rolling display outside, you'll see a little bit more about this, but this is the lockers which in wheat controls the pairing of the chromosomes. And if you play around with this, under certain genetic conditions, it means that wheat will cross with wild relatives, and you can bring in the diversity of those wild relatives. Very big success, pioneering work at the time. There is a problem, though, with bringing in that diversity. Bringing the diversity is great, but you need to monitor it. You need to know where it is. Those bits of chromosome that are coming in from the wild relatives will go into the wheat genome, and you need to know where they are in the wheat genome, and you need to know which bits from the wild relatives have come over from the wheat genome. That means you need a tracking device, and at that stage we did not have a tracking device. These tracking devices are now known as molecular markers. And using molecular markers, you can identify in each of the crosses that you do which individual piece of the chromosome is derived either from the wild relative or from the wheat itself. And so that was the next bit of the jigsaw puzzle that allowed us to advance this to the stage where it was actually useful to the community. In 2008, the BBSRC funded a piece of research, which is a collaboration between Bristol, John Innes and the University of Liverpool, to generate a lot of random sequence of the wheat genome. This was published in Nature in 2012, and it meant for the first time that we had a lot of DNA sequence from the wheat genome and its relatives. When you have that sequence, it means you can generate molecular markers from that sequence. And so this is a follow-on paper. Okay, so I apologize for people from Nature here, but that paper was fantastic, but this is the doing end. This is the delivery end of that process, taking that sequence and converting it into molecular markers. These molecular markers are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, irrelevant. But you can take these, and with genotyping companies, you can convert them to very cheap, very highly efficient, high throughput genetic tests. The kind of tests that you would have if you did 23andMe to find out where your ancestors came from. Exactly the same technology, but this is applied to wheat. And once we'd done this conversion from the sequences, then we had these hundreds of thousands of molecular markers. And the revolution that happened at that time, this is probably the most technical slide, so ignore it if you want to. The revolution is very difficult to comprehend now. We went from a period in 1 year from having virtually no molecular markers to having molecular markers wherever we wanted them. We could monitor any portion of the genome in any particular cross that we wanted to do, and we could do it relatively cheaply using high throughput genetics, robotics, etc. Just one very quick example of this. So this is what's called a genotyping array. There are 384 of these on this array. Each one of them monitors an individual wheat plant. And each one of these little pegs, as they're called here, has 35,000 molecular markers on it. So when you drop a piece of wheat DNA from an individual plant onto this, it will monitor the state of 35,000 regions of the genome. This one will do 820,000 regions of the genome. Amazing technology, which we now have, which the breeders use routinely. Okay, so the breeders use routinely. All of these markers, all of the work from the WISP is in the public domain, it's in the hand of the breeders, it's in the hands of the academics, and it's used every day by the global wheat community. This is a very good example of that. I know that Simon Griffiths is in the audience, looking over one of the field trial areas. The nice thing now is that you can plant your wheat. That's cheap, that's straightforward. But almost as cheaply, you can genotype that wheat and you can find out what genes and what alleles it has. Something that a few years ago was absolutely impossible to do. Okay. I don't know whether we're allowed to do this. I hope we are, but you have to remember that this is a cooperation. So this is many of the wheat community in the UK. This is a picture from several years ago from Rothamsted. There's a building where these people stand now, so that kind of ages it. But this is the wheat community as was then. It's not too different from it's now. Many of the people in this picture are in the audience. What I find amazing about this picture is that all of these people are either academics or breeders, and they're not grouped as academics or breeders. Academics and breeders sit next to or stand next to each other. So, for instance, this is a breeder. This is somebody from my group. Behind there's a breeder there. This is somebody from the University of Nottingham. Well, I think we know who this person is. It's a complete mixture of the community because that's how the community handles itself now. This is really a success for the way the community has organised itself, taken its strengths and its tools and technology and taken it forward. It's a lesson for collaboration in a UK environment. So I know that Graham would really like to thank the cereals group at the JIC, a fantastic group. I've always been envious of them. It was always my ambition to be employed by the John Innes, but I never quite made the grade. But they're here today. Tracy Drager, who has been a support for the past 28 years. Tracy's in the audience as well. I know that Graham would really like to thank the late Sir Ralph Riley for introducing him to wheat. And if you get a chance to talk to him today, asking about how he got that introduction, it shows you how fate plays a role in everybody's life and everybody's career. For me, in my group at Bristol, we have Dr. Sasha Allen and Gary Barker, who've been with me for 15 years. Notice these are academics, many of them on soft money, but they've been there for a long time. This community is very stable and very loyal. But I'd also like to thank Simon Bright and Peter Shorey. I reminded Simon of this last night. It was actually Simon about 25 years ago when I was at Gillett's Hill at Zenica Seeds, as we were then, who said to me, there's this chap who's making waves at the Plant Breeding Institute, Cambridge. I think his name's Graham Moore. I really think you should go over and maybe have a pub lunch with him because I think he's one to watch for the future. And I went on that pub lunch, and I actually remember the lunch. I remember meeting Graham for the first time 25 years ago. And then, of course, there's Peter. And Peter, for many people in the wheat community, has been, I won't call him a father figure, but he's been incredibly influential. And when I went to Long Ashton originally, I'd never worked on wheat. And it was Peter that gave me the opportunity when I was at Long Ashton to work on wheat. And the one thing I would say to Peter is that Long Ashton still remains my favourite site where I've ever worked. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
To give the citation for the Optoelectronics Prize. Miles. Thank you.
So the rank prize for optoelectronics this year is awarded to Tim Burks, Jonathan Knight, and Philip Russell for their invention and realization of photonic crystal fibers. From forming the backbone of the internet and enabling endoscopic medical imaging to the creation of ornamental lighting, optical fibers have gained everyday familiarity. Impressively, these glass wires will guide light over many tens of kilometers with almost no loss of intensity. Now, conventional optical fibers have been under development from the late 1960s, leading to the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physics. However, in 1996, our current prize winners, Tim Burks, Jonathan Knight, and Philip Russell, created a paradigm shift in our understanding of the guiding of light in optical fibers. Prior to their work, optical fibers were made from solid glasses with a combination of core and cladding designed to confine light within the central core of the fiber. Burks, Knight, and Russell took a completely different approach, where rather than using solid glass, they showed how a honeycomb structure of air-filled glass could form the fiber cladding, replacing the solid glass around the outside of the core. And with the air, increasing the confinement of the light, so much so that the fiber could form extremely high optical intensities, producing a nonlinear response in the glass. For example, when an ultra-short laser pulse is directed into the fiber, they can produce super intense sources of white light. Such sources now lie at the center of the world's time and frequency standards, an application that was recognized separately by a Nobel Prize in Physics again, this time in 2005. However, by extending their own thinking beyond these solid core honeycomb cladding fibers, our prize winners subsequently realized a radically different concept for their photonic crystal fibers. Variants of the honeycomb structure allowed the light to be confined not to a solid glass core, but to a hollow core. In this hollow core, the light is guided with a 50% higher speed than in the glass. Fibers of this type are now being investigated for time-critical communications, such as trading of stocks and shares. Additionally, these hollow fibers allow the guiding of particles through the core, the detection of gases, and the transmission of intense laser pulses. All applications where photonic crystal fiber makes the resulting instrument more compact, or more sensitive, or both. The research undertaken by Burks, Knight, and Russell in photonic crystal fiber has dominated both the scientific and the technical agenda, and also driven much of the subsequent commercialization. The current world annual market for photonic crystal fiber is approaching $1 million, with applications in biomedical imaging, microscopy, spectroscopy, sensing metrology, and laser gyroscopes. So, thank you.
Okay, yep. There it is. Well, I must say it's a huge pleasure to be here this evening, to see so many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces, friends and colleagues from the past. It's wonderful. And here I am speaking on behalf of my two former colleagues who are based at the University of Bath. You can see them here. There's Tim Burks, Jonathan Knight, and this guy here at the bottom. One thing about photonic crystal fibers that you didn't hear from Miles, and by the way, thank you very much for that nice introduction, Miles, is that it's proven to be an aesthetically very satisfying field with lots and lots of colored pictures and lots of different colors of light and patterns and all the kinds of things that artists like. So that this is a kind of gallery of some of the pictures. But I'm here not to talk about that, but to talk about, I think, mostly the science, but also a little bit about the story of how these fibers came about. So to do this, I'm going to have to introduce you to two concepts that existed before photonic crystal fibers emerged, and one of them has been touched on already. This is conventional optical fibers. These are very simple structures. They're used in telecommunications. They are the threads that connect the World Wide Web, and they are about the thickness of a human hair, slightly thicker in fact. You can hold them between finger and thumb up there in the top left. And they consist of a core which has a slightly higher refractive index. The light travels more slowly in the core than in the cladding. And this permits light to be trapped by a mechanism called total internal reflection. So rays of light can bounce to and fro, and they're unable to escape because of total internal reflection. And at certain angles, you will find a guided mode forms. Very simple idea, but has proven to be one of the greatest inventions. I think that's true to say. And there's Charles Cow back in 1966, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009, 43 years later or something. What a long time he had to wait. So the other idea was knocking around at the end of the 1980s, and this was the concept of the photonic band gap, which you would find, it's a phenomenon that you would find in something called a photonic crystal. So let me talk a little bit about photonic crystals at this point. So photonic crystals, it turns out, these are merely structures that are periodically structured on the scale of the wavelength of light. And there are many examples of these in nature. The carapaces of beetles, for example, butterfly wings, many examples of the beautiful colors you see. One of the most dramatic, though, is opal. And this is a movie of Ethiopian opal rotating under illumination with white light. And you see greens and blues and reds and lots of colors emerging and disappearing as the crystal rotates. This is caused by what we now call photonic crystals, and these are just pictures of what they might look like. They have different spacings. These are close-packed lattices of nanoscale silica spheres. So it's a kind of glass, and this forms under certain conditions. Now, if a beam of white light comes in and hits these crystals, you will see, depending on the angle and depending on the dimensions, the spacing between the spheres, different colors of light are distilled from white light. It's very much like a distillation process, except we're distilling light in this case, and you can't drink it afterwards. Okay, good. So how does this actually happen? Well, it turns out the physics of this was worked out 100 years ago or so by father and son. The son, Lawrence Bragg, and Henry Bragg, the father. He looks remarkably like John Cleese, I always think. So if you have an array of reflecting planes, and they're all very weak, they reflect very weakly the light coming in, and you put a beam of light in and you rotate it, you'll find that at a certain angle there's a very strong cumulative reflection because all these rays are in phase. It turns out that this Bragg angle here is precisely defined only when the reflections from the planes are very weak. And there's a condition that's well known. If you've studied physics, you'll know this condition. However, if you make the reflections from each of these planes very strong, then it turns out the Bragg condition broadens. And instead of there being a sharp angle, you find that all the light is reflected over a large angle, which I call delta phi there. If we now add two more sets of these planes, like this, and you can see this forms a kind of honeycomb lattice. And if this angle here is greater than, if 3 times this angle is greater than 360 degrees, you can prevent light from penetrating to the center of this material. And if you also make sure that internal modes are also suppressed, what you end up with is a 2-dimensional photonic band gap within which light cannot exist. You know, it's like saying there shall not be light, let there not be light. light cannot exist under any circumstances inside this material at certain wavelengths. And this is Eli Jablonowicz, who did some of the first experiments on this, this phenomenon. Okay, so photonic crystal fibers, we put these two things together, and we end up with an optical fiber. This looks a little bit like what you saw before, except in this case, the core is hollow, and we have a photonic crystal or photonic bandgap material on both sides of the core. It wraps around the core. And this time, if I put some light in of a certain color, and the angle and so on, the wavelength are wrong, the mode will be leaky, it dies away. Another angle, some blue light, I'll find that the mode also dies away. It's not guided, but if you choose to find the correct wavelength and the correct angle, you'll find you hit a photonic bandgap, and then the light is perfectly guided in this hollow core over kilometer distances in the best case. The idea for this came about, there's some notes that I made back in 1991, long before anyone had ever tried to make this kind of structure. Okay. So, well, you have an idea like this, and we were very uncertain right at the beginning. In fact, Tim Burks was the first person who worked with me on this. And way back when this paper was published, we hadn't made any fibers that worked, but we were trying to work out whether or not a photonic bandgap could actually exist. So I'm not going to tell you much about this diagram, except to say that we did indeed find, by solving Maxwell's equations, and to do that you needed quite powerful computers, which happened to be available back then, that you could indeed find conditions where the light is able to propagate in the hollow core and form a mode, but it's blocked from escaping into the cladding by the two-dimensional photonic bandgap. And it turns out that this magic point here was theoretical proof that this was possible. Of course, that's just theory. If you want to make something that works, you have to try things. And as you well know, the hardest part of any journey is taking the first step. If no one's ever done something before, you're never sure it will ever work. And that's how we felt back then, actually. But then in 1995, after Jonathan Knight had joined, Jonathan, Tim, and myself, we worked on structures. We succeeded finally, and this was at the University of Southampton, in producing something that looked a bit like a photonic crystal fiber. We noticed that light was guided in random kind of accidental sites in this crystal, this photonic crystal. So Jonathan put in a solid core deliberately and made the very first photonic crystal fiber, which doesn't actually guide by photonic bandgap effects, I'll tell you in a minute. But just some pictures from those days. We shortly afterwards moved to the University of Bath, and we were extremely fortunate in having this drawing tower donated to us from British Telecom. This is Clive Day operating the tower. Maybe some of you remember Clive. Operating the tower in the late 1970s. Pictures of Jonathan working on it, and I had the most ridiculous article in New Scientist with a picture of me with tubes all over my head. And that comes from that time as well. Okay, so how do we actually make the fibers? We start by stacking glass capillaries. This is about 1 centimeter in diameter. We draw this down to what we call a cane. So it's 10 times smaller. It's sort of stiff and about a couple of millimeters thick. And then we draw it down again by another factor of 10 in the drawing tower down to the final fiber itself. You can see a movie of this in the exhibition afterwards if you're interested. So some of the very first fibers that we drew with this BT tower do in fact show. It's a very simple experiment. You take a short length of fiber, put it in a microscope, some white light down below, and look in through the microscope at the top. And you do indeed see this distillation of the colors of white light down below. You see blue here and green and pink, all the colors of the rainbow coming out through the fiber because of the properties of the photonic crystal in the fiber itself. Okay, so the solid core photonic crystal fiber is the one that we first made. It has a missing hollow channel in the center. It guides by a kind of a modified form of total internal reflection in this case. So it's not a photonic bandgap effect. Nevertheless, this sort of fiber was interesting. In particular, because it was discovered shortly after we first reported it, that if you launched very short pulses of invisible infrared light into this fiber, then magically, or so it seemed at the time, you could generate all the colors of the rainbow and more besides, into the ultraviolet and into the infrared. And this is all because the core, as Miles actually mentioned, you can make a very tiny core and have hollow channels around it and keep the light very, very tightly confined in the glass. So under those circumstances, the material becomes nonlinear. And this enabled Ted Hench here, as he was one of the Nobel Prize winners back in 2005, to create ultra-precise optical clocks that use an octave spanning spectrum from this fiber in his work. Okay, so the other kind of fiber is the hollow core. And what I'm going to do is introduce this and then just tell you very briefly 4 applications of these fibers that we've been working on recently in Bath and also in Germany, where I'm based. So this is the hollow core variety. The core refractive index is less than the cladding, so this has to guide by some other effect, and the other effect is a 2-dimensional photonic band gap. It turns out there's another mechanism too, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So the hollow core, why is hollow core fiber interesting? Well, the main reason hollow core fiber is interesting is that you can do something that you cannot do in free space. You cannot keep light tightly focused in vacuum over long distances. It's just an impossibility because of diffraction. You can focus a laser beam down to a small spot, but of course, as anyone who works with cameras knows, there's a certain depth of focus, and this is because of diffraction. So the benefit of a higher intensity here is cancelled by the shorter interaction length. It's called the Rayleigh length, actually, hence John Strutt there from a stamp from Grenada. Hollow core PCF allows you for the first time, it provides the first practical solution of this problem. You can keep light tightly focused over essentially almost an infinite distance. In fact, the very best hollow core fibers that have been made provide 7 million times enhancement over just a focused laser beam in this sense. That's not the only thing hollow core fiber is good for. It's also very good for transmitting extremely high power laser light, very short pulses, very intense laser light, because there's no material in the core. There's no material there to be damaged. Conventional optical fibers damage very readily. You can guide much, much higher intensities of light in the hollow core. And you can also guide in spectral regions where normal fibers are not visible. This is work from the University of Bath of a very simple fiber structure that they came up with. And here you can see the absorption bands of hydrogen chloride in the infrared wavelength range here. This has astonishingly an attenuation which is 3,000 times less than that of the glass itself. So the glass, if you put light into the glass, you have an attenuation that's 3,000 times higher than the attenuation of the hollow core in this case. This fiber is being used, for example, to cut bone. This is a collaboration with Harriet Watt in Bath, and I also believe the University of Edinburgh. And here you can see the laser light being delivered by a fiber like this and cutting bone. Another application, and there's no time to explain this except that the results are very dramatic. This is a work that we do in my group, where we take a hollow core fiber and fill it with gas, in this case argon gas, and you put in a short pulse once again. The short pulse, this is the duration of the pulse at the input. It gets shorter and shorter and shorter and focuses down in time to a very, very short, very intense pulse. And at this point, you get some very intense nonlinear processes that generate a strong band of light in the deep ultraviolet. And it's very hard, actually, to find good sources of tunable ultraviolet light in this case. So this particular source, we've shown that you can tune the radiation right down into the vacuum ultraviolet, from the visible right down to the vacuum ultraviolet by using different gases. And the beautiful thing about this is that if you change the pressure, you can actually tune the system. You can tune the dispersion of the system, as a technical term for that. Another example, this time from the University of Bath, is a laser, a mid-infrared gas laser, in which one of these hollow core fibers is filled with acetylene gas, which has some absorption lines in the infrared, and this is now pumped with 1.5 micron laser light. This is the wavelength used in telecommunications, by the way. It's amplified up, sent into the fiber filled with this acetylene gas, and the laser then will laze at 3.1 micrometers, and here are some of the results of this. And this is, I think, the first actual laser that was created in a gas-filled hollow core fiber. The properties are really quite impressive in this case. So my final application, something completely different. Again, Miles, I think, touched on this. This is an optically guided flying particle sensor. It turns out that if you have a small particle of dielectric material, you can trap it using laser light. It will actually get captured by the the focused laser beam, and if you can trap it at the center of the core, so it gets held there by the light and it can't move and hit the glass around the edges, and it can be propelled along to quite high speeds. So here's a system where we have forward laser light, backward laser light. We capture a small particle here at the input. We turn up the forward power. We send the particle shooting along the fiber, and this can be hundreds of meters long, even kilometers long. We bring it to a halt where we want to do some sensing by increasing the backward power. And once it's there, we can do things like measure radiation levels. The hollow core does not go black in the presence of radiation, but you can send a particle in and for example, capture radioluminescence and measure it at the input of the fiber. You can make a temperature sensor, because it turns out the velocity of the particle depends on the viscosity of the air, and that depends on temperature. So by measuring the Doppler shift of the light that's reflected back, you can measure the velocity locally and therefore the temperature at that point. You can even measure electric fields by having a charged particle in the hollow core. And if there's a local electric field, the particle will get pushed to the side, and this will change the intensity of light that's transmitted through the fiber. So 4 applications, and that brings me to the end of the science. So just some pictures. Of course, so many people have worked on these fibers now that it would be, if I put all the names up, you wouldn't be able to read any of them. There's so many. But these are pictures from the early years at Bath, the most exciting time for us, I guess. You can see we all look a bit different, to say the least. So it's been a huge amount of fun, and particularly working with all these different people, different backgrounds. It's been wonderful. And just finally, thanks to the Rank Prize Committee, of course, for selecting us. We are very, very honored by this. Very pleased that the 3 of us have been awarded this prize. So there we are, around a fiber drawing furnace. So thank you.
Philip and Keith, thank you very, very much for bringing to life those immense pieces of research and the applications that can be drawn from them. Thank you again to the 2 subcommittees for those very, very difficult choices. If you look at the spectrum of work that is going on in Woodland research, and the 2 teams, one under Donal, one under Peter, who have to make those deliberations and those choices on who are worthy of prizes. And I think they are both this time inspired choices for those prizes. So thank you again for your hard work. I'd like to ask John if you'd like to say a few words on those research and your experience.
Well, thank you, Stuart, and what a pleasure it is to see so many familiar faces once more and to be back amongst friends. I do have the great privilege of being the first to congratulate the winners, our 5 winners here, and I was also so pleased to see that both presentations, what excellent presentations they were, gave tribute to their collaborative programs. Well, I noticed that the Opto Electronics Prize, they seem to drink more beer, but otherwise. I think both have in common the story about first-class cutting science, whether through our massive advances we've made in genome sequencing to discover new traits which will quite soon, we gather, move to the commercial breeder. And we had just a case just now, in the case of photonic crystal fibers, of applications in the bewildering range of disciplines. Examples of how Lord Rank, when he set up the Science Prize, identified, he'd been as Stuart reminded us, he'd been a successful businessman in 2 totally different businesses, his family business and the business he started himself. And he knew that without a really strong science base, he wouldn't be able to make the sort of progress that he had in life. A very successful businessman, and all credit to him, he set up the Rank Prize Fund in order to pay tribute and to reward and to thank the scientific community on which he depended so very much. We've struggled over the years in the United Kingdom, not necessarily in Europe in the same way, to transfer the really successful cutting-edge science into jobs, into wealth, into applications. We've often criticized ourselves for others having picked up our science and applied it before us. Now, we have another United Kingdom industrial strategy. Some of you will remember strategies going right back to Attlee's time, Harold Wilson time, Heseltine and others. And one, a little cynically, one tends to think that they've not always been very impressive in their results. Too often attempts have been made to shore up existing industries and a failure to identify where the most innovative and competitive industries are likely to be found in the following decades. That's not entirely true, I think, to be fair. I would quote as successes, for example, you remember in the 1970s, our car industry was something of a basket case. But since that virtual collapse, we have attracted inward investment from the continent of Europe, from Japan, from the United States and India, and it's a very buoyant sector. And likewise in the life sciences, and the genetic sequencing techniques we've heard about, sequencing of the human genome, have done an enormous amount to position us in extremely favorably in world markets, particularly as some of our major competitors are inhibited by legislation which isn't always appropriate or helpful. And I think the lessons that we can learn from that is that inward investment, which is after all what ultimately policymakers are trying to achieve, is going to be attracted first and foremost by the quality of science and engineering, of course, which I included. And that is found in the research councils in university, but also, never forget it, in industry itself. Then it's going to be attracted by the quality of the technical and vocational training. You must have the right people in order to pick up these emerging technologies. And that is going to be provided within industry, the engineering industry, the life science industries. And the universities, again, will have, in many cases, a critical role. It's, after all, the role of universities not just to do research, but to provide suitably equipped people for the new professions. And I would just here mention, because we hear an awful lot about the universities in the Golden Triangle and the like, that the new breeds of universities, like the universities of Sunderland and Teesside, which were polytechnics at one time, they are the sort of universities which have worked in the car manufacturing industry, which I referred to just now, closely with the local Japanese car plants. So what I'm saying is that there's a large range of providers of the technical and vocational training, and we've got to learn from those who've done it best. So the latest industrial strategy recognises that the United Kingdom can claim proudly and accurately to be one of the world's leading scientific nations. I don't think we're ever in any doubt of that, both in terms of fundamental and applied research. However, Mark Wolpert, until recently the government chief scientific advisor, has warned us that there is some evidence that the United Kingdom is falling behind when it comes to research and development upon which innovation depends. And he's now, of course, heading up the United Kingdom Research and Innovation, which brings together not just the research councils, but Innovate UK and other endeavours. So he's in a very good position now to address this issue. And I think it's going to be very important as we see, and I think one must welcome the funding streams which the coalition government and the present government have provided. It will be extremely important to make sure in this country that we start to bring up the amount of money available to promote innovation, which won't always be in universities, very often will be, but sometimes it'll be found in the most unexpected places in industry and elsewhere. And if you look at the balance between that spend in some of our colleagues on the continent of Europe, you'll find that historically we have underspent in that area. I'm sure that Mark Wolpert should be looking carefully at that. And how can we reduce the gulf between further and higher education? It's really part of the same syndrome. How can we attract more long-term investment into these high-value, innovative companies that we're going to rely on in the future? How can we continue to attract, in these turbulent times, the best scientists, as we have very successfully in the past, engineers from around the world to come, or indeed to collaborate from wherever they're based? And we've had an excellent example of such a collaboration tonight. And how can we promote technical education in our schools alongside, certainly not at the expense of, sciences, humanities, languages, and the arts? And I would just quote probably a figure which you're familiar with, that 70% of German students at the age of 18 will have some technical education. And in Britain, the figure will be around 30%. So there's a critical need, not just for our young and talented graduates, but also for people already in the workforce to be upskilled and retrained to contribute to what is a rapidly changing working environment. Now, my generation was able to put education behind us with a single skill set that would last a lifetime. Well, that's not remotely the case now. During my time as a trustee of the Rank Prize Funds, I was enormously impressed by how some of the country's most distinguished scientists took great trouble and time to participate in the Rank Symposia discussion meetings with fellow scientists of all ages, and these were usually organised by Judith very sensibly in the pole of inaccessibility, Grasmere, Wordsworth Hotel, so that people didn't leak away in the evenings. And the most interesting meetings that I attended as a layman addressed some of the societal and ethical issues that emerge from new technologies. As a member of the House of Lords, I was interested by the debate which went around the issues of science and society. You remember, again, it was a difficult time when scientists seemed to be taking the blame for some issues like BSE and cattle and the failure of the GM debate to be conducted adequately. And I think since then we've learnt a lot, and we've all recognised that whatever your position might be as a scientist or as a technologist, as an engineer, or as an informed member of the public, or as a lesser informed member of the public, you all have and are entitled to participate in a dialogue about how these emerging technologies might best be brought on to the benefit of a society, to the long-term benefit of society. There will be downsides. Disrupting technologies invariably have losers, but they also have opportunities. And again, I've been enormously privileged as a member of the House of Lords, which is, after all, a good debating chamber, to say nothing else, to have been able to listen to extremely well-informed debates on such issues as mitochondrial donation, something which arises from our understanding nowadays of the human genome, the implications to our society of scientific advances in information technology, new materials, robotics. All of these have ethical and societal implications, which we all are entitled. We all actually have a duty, I think, almost, to involve in discussion. And as I said, disruptive technologies will cause major issues to existing businesses, but also offer great opportunities to those with access to the relevant sciences and to the workforce with appropriate skills. And that was what Lord Rank recognised. So what we need is a lot more Lord Ranks. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much for bringing together and speaking so eloquently on that, those final interfaces that need to be considered, those of the interface with ethics, with policy, and with the inspiration for young scientists to join and be challenged and to be supported by more elder and revered scientists that we see here together. And I do dearly hope that there are some of the younger scientists here who we will see one day coming up for rank prizes for their research and the application of that research. I'd also like to thank John for throwing down the gauntlet between the nutritionalists and the optoelectronists on how much they can consume in the way of beer and actually So whilst there are a few photographs here for the prize winners with the Earl of Selborne, everyone else, if you'd like to go back to the Platt room for a little reviving tonic, we'll join you later there. But thank you all very much for attending.
Should we not applaud Judith and her podium?
Thank you all very much for coming on a cold February night. I hope that I found it hugely informing, and I think I've kept up with the pace on the science as well, which is a great testimony to our two speakers. Thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you later.